C-SPAN sat down with 14 members of Congress to get their firsthand experiences on what happened January 6th as they were counting and accepting Electoral College votes for the presidential election. They talked about what they saw, heard, and experienced that day while in the House chamber. Tonight we hear from three House lawmakers, Representatives Zoe Lofgren, Rodney Davis, and Madeleine Dean.
Madam Speaker and members of Congress, pursuant to the Constitution and the laws of the United States, the Senate and House of Representatives are meeting in joint session to verify the certificates and count the votes of the electors of the several states for President and Vice President of the United States.
At 1 p.m. on January 6th, the House and Senate met in joint session to count the electoral votes of the 2020 presidential election. An hour later, a mob entered the Capitol with the intention of disrupting the vote. As the protesters moved closer to the Senate and House chambers, Vice President Pence and Speaker Pelosi were evacuated to safe locations. Minutes later, security officials ushered House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer and other congressional leadership off the House floor. With tension rising in the building, the House and Senate abruptly recessed.
Without objection, the House is going to go back into recess.
There were a few dozen members of Congress in the House chamber at that time, including Representatives Zoe Lofgren and Rodney Davis, who both served as tellers for the counting of electoral votes. First, California Democrat Zoe Lofgren, who chairs the House Administration Committee. She starts by telling us about why she was sitting on the House dais that day.
So I am chair of the House Administration Committee and was tasked as such with being one of the tellers for the receiving the Electoral College votes, myself and the ranking member, Mr. Davis, and the Rules Committee, which is the equivalent committee in the Senate, Roy Blunt and Amy Klobuchar. And when there was an objection to the Arizona Electoral College votes, we broke, as the Constitution provides and the statute provides, into our separate bodies. Of course, we were already in the House chambers. I had been working with a team of other House members to try and prepare. We had heard that there could be challenges that we thought were improper. And so we had worked, myself and Joe Neguse and Jamie Raskin and some others to prepare our team for that discussion. And we really decided that, the primary people to defend the votes of the states were the members of Congress from that state. And so we had a lot of data and information that we were able to provide state delegations that might be challenged. And but I think I was the first to speak on the Democratic side defending the Constitution. And at the conclusion of my remarks, I needed to stay on the floor as a resource for the other members, but a lot of the Republican members were not wearing masks, and I wanted to stay as far away from their air as I could. I didn't want to get infected. So I went into the cloakroom, the Democratic cloakroom. There was no one there, and I felt somewhat, safer in terms of the COVID exposure from the Republicans. And we had their TVs in the cloakroom, and one was on to the floor proceedings. And I thought, well, I'll turn the other one on to news, see what's going on. And when I did, I saw that there was this tremendous mob outside the Congress, and that they appeared to be breaking into the Congress. And in fact, it looked like they had broken into the Congress. So I went back out on the floor, and no one seemed to be aware of that was going on. And I went back into the cloakroom, and by then there was one of the cloakroom staffers had, with a Capitol police officer, was trying to lock the doors. The doors into the cloakroom are bomb-proof. I mean, they're really heavy, and there's a lock, and the police officer was able to lock it so that people outside of the cloakroom couldn't get in, but he couldn't. There was some problem with the mechanism. He couldn't lock it, so people couldn't go out through that door. And I remember the staffer in the cloakroom saying, "No one's going out, don't worry about that." And I remember I went out back on the floor, and by then it seemed pretty apparent that there was a big problem. And I remember talking to Tom O'Halloran, who is a former sheriff and really an expert in security. And I said, "Tom, I think there's a problem. I think, there's a mob that's broken in." And he said, "Well, don't worry about that. There'll be a SWAT team on them, very soon." And I thought, I'm not adequately explaining what's going on here. I mean, Tom was waiting on the floor to speak. And by then we could hear pounding on the doors. And at some point I talked to, and I can't remember in what order, but the sergeant of arms who didn't seem too alarmed at the time, actually, but said, and we were getting alerts on our phones, like the Cannon office building had been locked down, and shelter in place. And around that point, I looked and realized that the speaker who had been presiding was being whisked away by her security team. And that's about, she's second in line to the presidency, the vice president and then the speaker in terms of line of succession. And I thought, we're in trouble here. Jim McGovern, the chairman of the Rules Committee, went to preside to try and keep matters going.
Members will take their seats. The House will be in order.
A police officer came and made an announcement that the Capitol had been breached.
We had a breach of the Capitol building. That is why we ordered a lockdown of both chambers, the House and the Senate. Capitol Police is responding to the area where the individual has breached the building, and we will advise you further information once it becomes available to us. Please remain calm and remain seated. You can move around inside, but please do not try to leave at this time until we give you further instruction. Thank you.
I think at some point, McGovern realized that we were not going to be able to continue the proceedings. A Capitol officer came and said that it was necessary to evacuate, and that we should take the hoods. There are hoods under the seat of each seat in the chamber. Take them out and be prepared to put them on. So everybody did, and I think when you pull the little red tag, it activates it, and so people weren't wearing them. There had been tear gas released in the chamber, in the rotunda, which was why we were advised that we might need to wear them. But there was this tremendous kind of whirring, hissing noise from all these hoods. It was the background of the moment. And of course, the pounding and the noise from the mob had become much louder. At some point, someone up in the chambers, in the gallery, a member was yelling at the Republicans to call Trump and have Trump call off his mob. And there was some little yelling back and forth among members in the gallery.
Call Trump! Tell him to call off his revolutionary guard!
it was pretty orderly on the House floor where I was. And as we were told to evacuate, we were really brought out to the speakers gallery and down a stairway. And at that point, I mean, we could hear people at the other end of the hallway, the mob. And I was down the stairs when glass was being broken. I think the officer that prevented the mob from entering probably saved our lives, because we were not completely evacuated. We were walking down the stairs, and there was one member who was quite infirm with a cane. He was in the front of the line, so everybody was backed up in back of him. And I thought, well, maybe we ought to lift him up and move him down a little quicker. And ultimately, we got to the Rayburn tunnel over to the Longworth, well, Capitol to Rayburn, and then to Longworth, where we walked. And it was a large group. I didn't count how many members, but a fairly large group. And they were going to shelter them in a room in the Longworth building. And, you know, my office is in the Longworth building. And I thought, you know, I'm on the 4th floor. I think I'll just go there. So they went right, I went left, and went up to the 4th floor of my office, which was barricaded. My chief of staff was there and had all by herself moved this gigantic table to block the door. And so she unblocked it enough for me to get in. And I realized then that we were probably at least safe from the mob for the moment. I mean, throughout this time, my family, especially my son and daughter, had been texting me, making sure that I was safe. And I said, well, you know, I'm safe. I'm on the floor of the house. And they're going, we don't think so. And so I was able to text them that I was in my office. And I felt that, you know, looking out the window, I have a view of the Capitol. I could see the tremendous chaos across the street, and that it was really uncontrolled. And I didn't know what would happen next, whether mobs would breach the office buildings in their search to hunt down members, or really what was going on. I did text the authorities wondering why steps were not being taken to control the mob. And I realize now it's because the forces were completely overwhelmed. They couldn't have actually have done that. But I couldn't help but contrast the kind of very aggressive crowd control measures used against Black Lives Matter demonstrators, who were for the most part peaceful, and the reaction to this violent mob. You know, we waited there for, you know, many hours until finally the guard arrived and the matter was under control. I was on the phone, of course, with Jamie Fleet, the staff director for House Admin, who was over there. And I said, it's essential that we get back into the building itself. There was an opportunity to go finish our business at a secure location. I said, that's not going to be good enough. We need to show the country that the mob did not overturn this government. And of course, the speaker was thinking the same thing. Jamie went over and said it was really a mess. I mean, actually, the mob never got into the chambers, our chambers. They did the Senate. But he said there was blood on the floor, and it was a really, the place had been trashed. And the janitorial staff was over there cleaning it up, making sure that the Congress could reconvene. And as soon as it was safe and the bomb dogs had been through, we did reconvene. And I was there till the end. At the end of all of the counting, the tellers had to stay and sign things. So I didn't get back to my residence in DC till after 3. And that's when I knew that I was safe.
And when you got to your residence at 3 a.m., do you remember the feeling and the thoughts you had as you presumably sort of had time to reflect on the day?
I really felt, what a tragic day for the United States, that this frenzied mob could have breached the Capitol, something that didn't even happen in the Civil War, and try and essentially overthrow the government. I mean, we were in the middle of a constitutional process that is key to implementing the votes of the American people in the selection of their next president. And they tried to prevent that from happening. It's sedition. So it was a very, very troubling day for the United States.
Also on the House dais that day was Illinois Republican Rodney Davis, the House Administration Committee's ranking member. He recounts his experience at the front of the House chamber on January 6th.
I was one of the 4 tellers that was tasked with reading the Electoral College results from each state, sitting in front of the Vice President and also the Speaker of the House. And this has been a pretty perfunctory operation. When I've been witnessing it before as a member of Congress, we knew this one was going to be a little more, a little more popular to watch. But at the same time, I didn't think we would see what we saw that day.
And you were one of the tellers. And at what point do you realize something's going on outside of the chamber doors?
Well, earlier in the day, I just anticipated being on the floor for a very long time. And I remember being over in Rayburn, and I was grabbing a quick bite to eat at the Subway shop that's in the basement. And I'm like, I better just go ahead and get 2 sandwiches so I might be able to come back here during a debate and eat the other one for dinner later. And I got those 2 sandwiches, and I remember thinking to myself that this will be somewhat normal and just be a long day, and we'll get through it and listen to the debate, have the votes and what have you. But I started noticing something wasn't right when we began debating Arizona. And while that debate was going on, I went down to the Sergeant at Arms office, and I saw on the many video screens that they had of the outdoor cameras, I saw different parts of the perimeter being breached. I saw our Capitol police officers in the Capitol basically panicking, not panicking, but it being a very high alert, somewhat panicked mode. And that is when I ran back to my office, and I'm going to eat at least one of these sandwiches real quick while I'm waiting to get some answers. And my team called me because they were on the floor, my House administration team. And that was Jen Dalby, my staff director, Tim Monahan, my deputy staff director, Nick Crocker, my director of member services, and Caleb Hayes, who's my general counsel. Jen called me and said, I think you better get back here. They're talking about closing the floor down. And I hurried up and ate my sandwich as I was walking out my office door. And I was walking onto the floor as leadership was being evacuated. And I saw Steve Scalise and his team going out as I was going in.
Did you have a conversation with them?
It was, let's just say my comment can now be summed up via text as WTF.
And did they say, anybody from leadership tell you what was going on as they were being exited out, or did they have any comment?
No, we all knew what was going on. I had already seen the outer perimeter being breached on those video screens in the Sergeant at Arms office. So I was going onto the floor while they were leaving. And just minutes later, that's when all the doors were shut. We were seeing footage of the Senate being breached. So everybody was on pretty high alert. And I was talking to new members, helping them to open up the hoods that I'd never touched before in my 8 years as a member of Congress. Now we're figuring out how to open them and how to possibly put them on, which I never had to do. But at the same time, there were a lot of freshmen there that I'd gotten to know during orientation, that this was their first real experience as a member of Congress. And we were kind of watching them and talking to my fellow colleagues about what we could do to try and stop this.
What were those conversations like? Tell us about them.
Well, I remember a conversation I had with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie was a freshman. She was very active during the orientation, and she was very upset about what was going on. And her and I chatted. She said, "What can I do?" I said, "How about you go back in the cloakroom, film a video, post it on social media, and if you have any influence over anybody out there, tell them to stop." She did that. Those are the types, that's just one example of the types of conversations we had during that short time before we were evacuated off the floor.
So you're waiting, you're watching, and what do the Capitol Police, or who evacuates you off the floor? What was that like?
Well, the most superior Capitol Police officer, after all of the internal doors were locked and the wooden doors that I've, really not seen on the inside, because usually they're open when we're coming through them, they were all locked, and those doors began to be pounded on by the folks who broke into the Capitol. They were offering instructions to remain calm and stay in the chamber. The chamber is safe. And then next thing you know, they said, "Everybody move to this side, this exit." And when we were going about exiting in an orderly fashion on what I would say is the Republican side of the speaker's lobby, we could hear the pounding going on the speaker's lobby doors. I was with my team, and we were near the end of all the members being evacuated. Some members I would ask, "Hey, are you okay?" I remember giving Jeannie Raskin a big hug as he was evacuating because of what happened with his son just a few days or weeks earlier. I hadn't had a chance to see him yet. That, thinking back, that was pretty surreal now to think about that at the time. But, just the tragedy that he went through, and now going through the evacuation off the House floor. I felt for him and everybody else. But I walked out the door and immediately ran into one of my colleagues, Ron Wright, who has since passed away, but was undergoing treatments for lung cancer. He couldn't walk down the stairs. So the bottom line is, a Capitol Police officer and I picked Ron up and we carried him down the stairs. And by the grace of God, there was a wheelchair on the first floor that we used to get him fully evacuated.
What were you thinking as you were going about this?
How brave the Capitol Police officers were. I've seen that bravery already on the baseball field in Alexandria, Virginia, just a few years ago. I saw what well-trained officers do when they run toward gunfire so all of us could run away from it. And I saw that same bravery from the Capitol Police that day as we were being evacuated and as they wanted to do their job to get everybody safely off that floor and out of that speaker's lobby and into a safer area. It was very surreal when I was able to go back to the Capitol before everyone else. We finally left the floor at 4 a.m. I was one of the last people off the floor after signing the official canvases, watched the vice president leave, Speaker Pelosi and others. I went back to my office and changed because I had a 6:30 a.m. flight back home. So I go from being a teller on the House floor to complete a process that's going to go down in our nation's history as one of the worst days in the legislative branch history. But in the end, I'm going back in jeans. I go put my jeans on, a hat on, a coat on, and I go take a quick nap at the United Gate at Reagan National. And the irony is, as I woke up, there were people that could have been in the Capitol that day that were sitting around next to us getting on our flight. So I don't think they realize the impact of the decision that they may have made to break the law and disobey a direct order and come into that Capitol. And they should be held accountable for that.
While Congressman Davis was acting as a teller, Democrat Madeleine Dean was preparing to debate the challenge to electoral votes from her home state of Pennsylvania. Here's how she started her day.
I was preparing for the Pennsylvania challenge to the electors. So what I wanted to do, and we were doing it in a distance way, I wanted to listen in on the first challenge, which was Arizona. So I had left my office in Cannon. I had an allotted time to go up to the gallery to listen in and observe. At the same time, I was finalizing my remarks. And so as I waited in the gallery and heard the arguments being made, I remember standing in the gallery next to Dean Phillips, Congressman Dean Phillips. And the two of us were listening to the arguments and just saying, oh, shame to be making these false arguments. In anticipation of the day, I made sure that none of my staff was in. We expected it could be difficult. We had planned that I would park underground, that I would use only the underground tunnels, knowing that there could be outside protests of some kinds. And so out of an abundance of safety and caution, I made sure we stayed underground. I made sure nobody was in our offices, and I was up in the gallery. The very first notice that something was wrong was we had I was standing next to Dean, and there was a strange announcement from the floor, which was sit down. Would everybody please sit down? And then we complied, of course. And then it was, would everybody either kneel or prepare to lie on the ground? And that was just strange and stunning. With that, I started to plan, and I thought, well, there is this front wall in the gallery. Maybe I would just shield myself behind a front wall if there's some concern. So I started to move down a few, it's sort of stadium seating there, down a few rows, and in fact, encouraged another colleague to come with me. And then with that, they said, would you take out your gas masks? They're under your seats. I had no idea there were gas masks under the seat. That stunned me. And so we all scrambled and got the gas masks. I don't know if you saw some of the footage of that, but they are triple wrapped. So we were helping one another, kneeling down on the ground, trying to protect ourselves, unwrapping these tinfoil wrappers, and finally readied our gas mask. I remember looking over, and Veronica Escobar was wearing a beautiful white jacket and standing and on a phone trying to get her gas mask. And I thought, she just looks like too beautiful a target. And I'm yelling at her, get down, lean down. And then they said, please put on your gas masks. The rioters have reached the rotunda and tear gas has been dispensed. All the while, I have to admit, somewhere in me, there is this maybe protective mechanism where you think, well, all right, these are all very important protections they are signaling to us, but certainly they won't be necessary here in the chamber. And the moment that I thought that, I heard the banging on the chamber doors, the ramming, sort of baton-like into the chamber doors. That, to me, signaled the extraordinary seriousness of it. Having no idea the numbers or anything else, but to hear that banging, it was the most frightening sound and made it extremely real. With that, we were told, get our gas masks on, wait instructions to go across the top of the gallery and to a safe place. But I was terrified. I called my husband, I called my son. I feel bad now. I scared them.
And what were those conversations like? with your husband and your son?
I remember my son, I could hear his wife there. They were on speakerphone together, and they were just begging me to stay safe. I do feel bad that I scared them. But I always had confidence that we'd be all right. I didn't really get the gravity of it. I did sort of visualize that from that place where the piercing of the doors took place, that certainly a weapon, I pictured, you know, sort of an AR style weapon spraying around the chamber, and you could just have at your targets, both on the ground and up in the gallery. So that's why I just kept staying below that wall. So the conversations where I tried to assure them that they will get us to a safe spot. I'll be all right.
And what were the conversations like with your colleagues as you're trying to hide yourself and protect yourself behind that wall in the gallery?
That it was unreal. I kept using the expression actually as the arguments were going on, that do they recognize they've taken this lie so far, too far? And that's what I talked with Dean about as we were waiting there. It's just, don't they realize how dangerously far they have taken this lie, these false arguments, how they've misled the American people into having Americans attack Americans? But I have to admit to you, Greta, because we did not have the benefit of television, I had no idea the numbers. I remember at one point, prior to the breaking into the gallery, I wanted to go back to the office, Cannon House office building, to finish my remarks. And as I tried to, a very nice, very tall Capitol Police officer said, "Ma'am, you can't go back there. There's a bomb threat." So I thought I will peek at, she said, "Go back to wherever you just were." So I said, "I'm going back to the gallery." I peeked out a window in a darkened office. I actually went into this darkened open office and peeked out sort of a porthole window up at the top of that portion of the gallery, and saw the other side of the Capitol, the plaza side. And there weren't so many protesters. You could see some, but it didn't look anything like what was happening on the other side. So I had some reassurance, this is prior to the banging, but some reassurance that, you know, all was well, at least on this side. With that, I heard a radio system talking about infiltration of the Capitol Visitor Center, almost like a radio report that someone had gotten into the Capitol Visitor Center. That's when I went back into the gallery, and then we got that series of instructions. So again, I think your mind just says, well, okay, maybe it's a dozen people got in. You know, maybe the Capitol Police are having to deal with 24 people. As they raced us off, it seemed so ad hoc. They said, "We're going to get you to a safe place." And they started yelling Rayburn Cafeteria, and streams of us went down escalators through the tunnels. Journalists and others and staff together, many members, of course, and raced our way through those tunnels with very few officers visible to us. In fact, the one man who was directing traffic literally had on one of those sort of yellow traffic illuminated guard vests. Go this way, go this way. And I remember as we ran out, you asked me about my colleagues, as we ran out, we were climbing over chairs, climbing over railings. I remember at one point, Paul Tonka was trying to get under a railing, and whoever was in front of him didn't mean it, but kicked him in the face. It was just desperate, people just moving. They raced us to, and I don't know what the plan was, but they raced us to Rayburn Cafeteria, which made no sense whatsoever because it was floor to ceiling glass on the ground. And then I started to call my staff and said, "This is ridiculous. This is not a safe space. I don't know what they're thinking." And not too long after, they moved us over to what everybody now knows was the Ways and Means room. But the conversations were stunned, terrified disbelief. it was at least 2 hours before I saw television and knew the volume and the violence of what was going on. I'm still upset over staff and what happened to staff. I remember at one point when we were guarded into a room, I'm sure it was with the best intention, but they said, you know, members only, members only. Well, what was staff supposed to do? Stand in the hallway and be victim? So fortunately, it was just a mix of folks that all went into that large room where I made the remainder of my calls to family, said, I'm in a safe space. And can you tell us where you are? And I said, no, because they've asked us not, just for everybody's safety. But I assure you, I'm in a safe space with many of our colleagues. And then I stood there with Susan Wild. I remember in particular, I pulled up a chair and she sat down. Who's our colleague who's a doctor? Is it Ruiz? Oh, I'm forgetting his name, but the colleague who is a doctor, physician, he came around to a person and said, are you all right? Do you have any underlying health conditions? You saw the photograph of Susan Wild with Jason Crow holding her hand up in the gallery as they awaited their escape. And she talked with the doctor through what she was feeling. And he talked her through it also. So I tell you that to say that I remember I said right away to my colleagues that we have to catalog the heroic kindnesses, the good acts along with the bad. There were lots of good acts.
And you were in that room for how long?
I think it was 4+ hours. And this is how disorienting the whole experience was. I was desperate for a ladies' room and a television. And then I looked around and I said, oh my God, of course I know this room very well. I was here for impeachment 1. And so I knew the back rooms, I knew where the ladies' room was. So probably halfway through our holding, I went back into that small area behind the Ways and Means room where members, Republican and Democrats, were watching news. We had Fox on, we had CNN or MSNBC. So it was literally about 2 hours in when I got to see the magnitude of this insurrection and the gravity of it. And so I was back there, get water, use the restroom, and just watch in stunned disbelief in that back room with Republicans and Democrats.
And at that point, as you understand how many people came to the Capitol, at that point, now what are the conversations like with your colleagues?
I remember I spoke to a couple of Republicans, three of whom said, let's just make this a private conversation. So I wouldn't say who it was, but they too were stunned and shocked and in horror and in disbelief. I will say there was a moment early on in the holding room that I thought was very powerful. And that is when both Hakeem Jeffries and Liz Cheney stood, you can picture the room with microphones, each of them, parallel to each other, and saying the same words, directions as to please don't reveal where you are, don't take interviews. If you have any issues, any medical issues, blah, blah, blah. And in unison, the power of saying, and we will go back and complete our duty. We will return to the floor and complete our constitutional duty. I thought it was just a powerful moment of unity and of clarity that we had a job to do, and this shameful, deadly insurrection incited by a failed president would not stop us.
You are in that room for 4 hours. What happens then? What happens next?
Let me point out also, while we were in that room, which did make the news, and it should have, most of us wore masks and some scoffed. And, we had to be necessarily quite close together because it was hundreds of people, and some scoffed. You saw as Lisa Blunt Rochester very graciously offered masks to Republican members who said no. So, between the shame of the arguments, the shame of aiding that incited insurrection, and the shame of using the pandemic as a political football and not being interested in protecting themselves or their colleagues or their staff. It was just an infuriating set of emotions. I was in touch with Mary Gay Scanlon, my colleague in Pennsylvania. She was trapped in her office and invited me when I should be released, invited others, we go by the Fab Four. In fact, we all wound up there. After being in that room for so very long, I texted her, was she still okay? Was still okay. And so I made my way, now in the dark, I don't know what hour it was, to her office in Longworth. And she let me in. She had literally barricaded her doors. She had moved her desk away from the window. Just a total quick reconfiguration of her office entirely to protect herself against an attack. Just insane, insane. So I spent maybe an hour or so there with her, talking, seeing how she was. I think Susan came in. I know Chrissy Houlihan came in, Susan Wild, and everybody talked about where they were.
How often do you think about that day, and does it make you get emotional when you do?
I'm sure I think of it every single day. Mostly not emotionally, mostly in utter disbelief that that actually happened. It is stunning to me that Americans attacked Americans, that they attacked police officers. They beat, and in one case killed, a police officer. And it was all riled up and radicalized over an incredible, insidious infection, an infection of lies about one another. The power of lies to do that kind of damage to human beings, to our democracy, to our seat of government. So I know I think of it every single day. And I think of the precariousness of it all. For the Republican members who continued with the challenge, I always think, don't they realize they were at risk just as much as I was? Those rioters weren't going to say, oh, wait a second, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? They didn't care about Mike Pence being a Republican, being the vice president to the president and to all of us. They wanted to kill him. If they had gotten their hands on any one of us, it's infuriating. And I'm in a bit of disbelief to this day.
Shortly after 3:30 in the morning on January 7th, lawmakers certified the results of the 2020 presidential election.
The whole number of electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for Vice President of the United States are as follows. Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 306 votes. Michael R. Pence of the state of Indiana has received 232 votes. The purpose of the joint session having concluded, pursuant to Senate Concurrent Resolution 1, 117th Congress, the chair declares the joint session dissolved.
Our coverage of the January 6th joint session and the congressional hearings examining what happened at the Capitol on that day can be found at our website, cspan.org. Stay with C-SPAN for continuing coverage of the investigation into the January 6th attack.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy held a news conference before the first hearing of the January 6th Select Committee, which is investigating the attack on the U.S. Capitol. I'll look now at his remarks along with some of his GOP colleagues.
Thank you all for coming. I first want to start by expressing my condolences to Deputy Philip Campus, an officer who was selfishly serving his community in Kern County, who was killed in the line of duty on Sunday. He is a father, a husband, a Kern County Sheriff officer, and a former Marine. 3 others were shot in the standoff as well. Our prayers are with his family and those who were wounded as they continue to break through this. Each of us are indebted to our brave Capitol Police officers who come every day to this house prepared to defend us. On January 6th, these brave officers were put into a vulnerable and impossible position because of the leadership at the top has failed. December 14th, the leadership knew there was a problem. Even prior to that, Inspector General report told us there was failed leadership at the top of the police for the training. Rodney Davis will speak in a moment of a bill that he had to make sure the structure of the Capitol Police would change. We had many failures within the leadership. You had a chair of House administration with responsibility that did not come to the Capitol for more than 6 months. First time showing back up on January 3rd to vote for the Speaker. No hearings about the IG report. No movement of Rodney Davis's bill. There's questions into the leadership within the structure of the Speaker's office, where they denied the ability to bring the National Guard here. We now have a committee that all of America wants to know the answers to. Why were we ill-prepared for that day, and how can we make sure that it will never happen again? But unfortunately, Speaker Pelosi will only pick on people onto the committee that will ask the questions she wants asked. That becomes a failed committee and a failed report, a sham that no one can believe. If you want the true answers, do not be afraid of the questions that will get asked. And drive the evidence to wherever it comes forward. We owe it to the officers, we owe it to the nation, to have an open and fair debate with all questions being asked. Again, the Republicans want to participate with the Republicans that are able to be on the committee, that have jurisdiction, have the knowledge, and the ability to ask the tough questions that can get the right answers. It's unfortunate we start with a committee chair who will tell you everything's on the table except the Speaker's office. How can you ever get to the bottom of the questions? How can you ever get to the solutions to make sure the Capitol is never put in this position again? From December 14th, they knew. The last time there was a break in the line was during the Kavanaugh hearings. Why weren't changes made then? Why weren't action taken after the IG report? It's a lot of questions that could get asked today to make sure these officers will never be put in this position. January 6th should have never happened. We should have prepared and be prepared for the officers, make sure they had the training and the equipment that they needed. With that, I'd like to call up our whip, Steve Scalise.
Thank you, Kevin, and I share those same sentiments. Our prayers go out to so many law enforcement officers who lost their lives in the last year. And every day, we thank those Capitol Police officers who risk their lives to keep us safe and to keep this Capitol hopefully open again to tourists who can come to the Capitol to see their government in action. But what we're here to talk about today is Speaker Pelosi's constant attempt to cover up facts that she doesn't want out there. You know, for weeks now, Jim Jordan and Jim Banks have been raising some very tough questions, questions that need to be answered about why Speaker Pelosi didn't make sure that Capitol Police had all the tools they needed to be prepared for that day. Now, maybe because they were raising those questions, they got canceled by this new cancel culture that we see moving throughout the country, led by Speaker Pelosi and a lot of our socialist allies here in Congress, where they want to shut out voices that raise tough questions that they don't want to be asked or answered. And yet, they were starting to raise those questions about why the Capitol Police didn't have the tools they needed. What kind of intelligence did Speaker Pelosi get early off, weeks in advance, as Leader McCarthy talked about, that gave telltale signals that could have prevented what happened on January 6th? But Speaker Pelosi said that she doesn't want those questions asked, so she kicked them off the committee. She took an unprecedented step of refusing to allow members to be appointed by the minority leader to a select committee. Had never before happened in the history of Congress. And so as we see these kind of actions taken by Speaker Pelosi to cover up the facts that she doesn't want out there, it has completely debased the legitimacy of this commission, because clearly they're not searching for the truth. They're searching to get a narrative out that Speaker Pelosi has already written. And anybody that's going to ask questions that go against that, she just has them removed so that they can't bring those questions up. That's not an investigative panel. People know that. We've seen other bodies. The Senate's done some investigative work. The Department of Justice has done some investigative work. And it should be about following the facts, not about trying to cover up facts that tell a story differently than the one she maybe has already had written, and she just wants to now get others to back it up. So it's unfortunate that she's done it, because clearly it can't be about people who voted against certifying electors, because she appointed members herself who voted against certifying electors on January 6th, against them on January 6th of 2005, some of her own members who objected on January 6th of 2017. So clearly that's not what it's about. It's probably more about some of the tough questions that were already being raised by Jim Jordan and Jim Banks. And that's a shame, because those questions need to be asked and answered as well. And now they're not, because of the cover-up that Speaker Pelosi's continued to do. We see this with COVID. She won't hold a hearing on the origins of COVID. Too often we've seen this pattern by Speaker Pelosi of trying to cover up a narrative that she doesn't want out there, when we should be trying to get all of the facts. Now to come up next is our conference chair, ELISE STEFANIK.
There is a reason that Nancy Pelosi is the most disliked elected official in America. She always puts her own partisan politics over what's best for the American people. She's an authoritarian who has broken the people's house. She is a lame duck speaker, and everyone knows it. The reason why Nancy Pelosi is refusing to seat accomplished and well-respected hardworking Republicans like Jim Jordan and Jim Banks is because she doesn't want the American people to know the truth or learn the facts. She doesn't want a fair or bipartisan investigation. She wants a political one. It is a fact that in December of 2020, Nancy Pelosi was made aware of potential security threats to the Capitol, and she failed to act. It is a fact that the U.S. Capitol Police raised concerns, and rather than providing them with the support and resources they needed and they deserved, she prioritized her partisan political optics over their safety. The American people deserve to know the truth, that Nancy Pelosi bears responsibility as Speaker of the House for the tragedy that occurred on January 6th. And it was only after Republicans started asking these important questions that she refused to seat them. House Republicans will continue to follow the truth and the facts and support our law enforcement officers to make sure this never happens again in the U.S. Capitol, the People's House. And I'm proud to turn it over to my colleague, very well-respected member, Jim Banks.
Today we will hear tragic stories by Capitol Police officers, tragic events that should have never happened at this Capitol building on January 6th, tragic events that happened on Speaker Nancy Pelosi's watch. It's clear at this point that Nancy Pelosi has cherry-picked the members to serve on this committee. She's pre-written a narrative. Only members who will stick to her talking points are allowed to serve on this committee. If this is truly a fact-finding mission to make sure that January 6th never happens again, this isn't what that looks like. Today, I want to repeat a call that I made last week to the chairman of this committee to bring before this committee today on this panel the head of the Capitol Police Union, who told many of us last week and has said publicly and privately that on January 6th, the rank and file members of the Capitol Police Department, the heroes that make up, the men and women, the heroes that make up the Capitol Police Department, they were not prepared for what happened on January 6th in spite of intelligence reports that date back 3 weeks before that day. They weren't equipped on January 6th with the proper equipment that they needed to handle what happened that day. And they weren't trained for what was going to happen that day. As the Senate investigation report, a bipartisan report, already identified, there was a systemic breakdown of security, a lack of leadership at the very top of the United States Capitol Police who report and who Nancy Pelosi is ultimately responsible for that lack of leadership. That's where this committee should go if it's serious about making sure that something like this never happens again. Bring the head of the United States Capitol Police Union to sit on the panel today to provide a different perspective than the cherry-picked narrative that Nancy Pelosi wants the American people to hear. I repeat that call. I hope that the Democrats will think better of what they've already rejected the head of the Capitol Police Union. I hope they think better of it. Bring him before the panel today. Give him a chance to testify before the American people. Thank you. I'll defer to Representative Jordan.
Why don't the Democrats want to get to the truth? Why don't they want to answer the fundamental question, which is why wasn't there a better security posture on that day? Let me just read from a news account from February of this year. Pelosi's office had previously impressed upon the Sergeant of Arms, Paul Irving, that the National Guard was to remain off Capitol grounds. Irving told House administration the discussion centered around the, quote, optics. Why were the Democrats so concerned about the optics? Why were they so concerned about how it would look? Because what happened last summer? It's all driven by what happened last summer, where Democrats normalized anarchy, normalized political violence, raised bail money for the very rioters and looters who destroyed small businesses, attacked innocent civilians, and maybe most importantly, attacked police officers. When you spend a year talking about defunding the police and actually defund the police, it's kind of hard to have more police here on January 6th like they should have done. That's the fundamental question. That's why this thing has turned into such a political charade. The police officers who will testify today, and frankly all Capitol Hill police officers, deserve to have more help that day. But the Democrats couldn't do it because of the political position they had taken all throughout last year. That's the fundamental question that won't be answered. That's why Republicans aren't serving on this committee.
Monday night on The Communicators, technology reporters discuss the future of the tech industry and Congress's tech agenda.
When you look at the priorities that are kind of dominating Congress right now, you've seen the pandemic take over early in the year, you're seeing infrastructure take over now. I think there are a lot of big tech topics that have historically, in the last year or so, attracted interest that just aren't front and center. I mean, I think that includes the Section 230 debates. I think data privacy was something that, was hugely front and center in the tech space, maybe, 2019, some of 2020 initially. Those things are kind of off to the side a little bit right now. I think they're very important. People are interested, but there's not any consensus proposal out there in either chamber that's really going to move in any imminent ways.
The future of the tech industry, Monday night at 8 Eastern on The Communicators on C-SPAN 2.
C-SPAN is your unfiltered view of government. We're funded by these
Mayor Ginsburg, you have a new book called First Friends, which is a different take on presidential biographies. Tell me about the concept.
Well, I have been endlessly fascinated by the American presidency since I was a kid. And as I grew older, I started to work on campaigns, and then I worked in the Clinton administration. And I started to notice this dynamic between the leader's best friend and the leader himself, and how that best friend could speak in a way that no aide or staffer could, speak more bluntly, act more naturally. And I saw it with Warren Beatty in the Gary Hart campaign, how he would fly in for major campaign events and speak to the candidate in a way that no one else around him was at the time, and say, he would say all the time, "Stop acting and talking like a politician, Gary." And Gary would get quite roused by that, but he would listen and he would change the way he spoke. And I also saw how he would relax him then at night with late night conversations, late night dinners. And then I saw the same dynamic at play in the Bill Clinton campaign with Vernon Jordan, and how they were of equal stature, and what that allowed Clinton to get from Jordan in a way that he couldn't from anybody else who worked on the campaign and then in the administration itself. And so I thought, well, this is an interesting dynamic. It's true in my life, how my friends can relate to me in a way that coworkers couldn't, or bosses certainly couldn't. So as I grew older and had this interest in writing a book, I looked at presidential literature to see if there was anything about that first friend, and curiously, there was nothing. There was books about first chefs and first butlers, first wives, first sons, but nothing about the role of the first friend throughout the American presidency. So I saw the niche, and I decided it's a really interesting new lens into understanding the men who've occupied that job, and how it's affected him emotionally as well as substantively, and in many cases affected real decisions.
How did you ultimately make the decisions about the 9 that would be included?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about Bill Clinton, having worked for him and having, as I said, witnessed the Vernon Jordan relationship. And he was the one president I obviously could ask, who was your best friend? And Bill Clinton, as many of your viewers know, had a lot of friends. He had the Friends of Bill during the 1992 campaign, who rescued him during the New Hampshire primary when his campaign was teetering. So I called him. He was interested in the idea. I said, "Would you pick your first friend?" He came back a few weeks later and said, "It's Vernon Jordan." And I was fortunate because I had already spoken to Vernon Jordan about his relationship with Bill Clinton. So I was quite fortunate to have that merging. With Kennedy, I knew I wanted to write about him as well, because he too was somebody who had a lot of friends and reveled in the friendships he enjoyed. I asked his daughter, Caroline, who was a longtime friend of mine. She fortunately didn't give me the obvious names of a Lem Billings or a Dave Powers or a Ben Bradley, but she said, "I'm going to give you the person who I think has kind of been lost to history, but from my own experience, I know was my father's and my mother's, very, very dear friend, and it's David Ormsby Gore." And it took me a while to figure out the story. You had to kind of dig for it, but when I discovered it, it was a real joy. And I hope, it's one of the more, I think, substantive chapters in the sense of the role that Ormsby Gore plays in Kennedy's both life personally as well as his presidency. And then with some, they were kind of obvious. Joshua Speed and Abraham Lincoln. There's a great book by Charles Strozer that details that relationship quite well. Colonel House was another obvious choice, although there has never been a book about just their friendship. There have been biographies of House, but not about his specific relationship just with Wilson in the context of, in some kind of digestible form. Some were just a total joy to discover, like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Franklin Pierce. I didn't know anything about it. My father-in-law actually gave me the idea, and I found that there's a really rich story there. In Madison Jefferson, you know each of them individually, but I had no appreciation for the dynamic at play that allowed each of them to become who they were because of a friendship.
Having a friendship doesn't seem to necessarily guarantee a successful presidency, however. Is that right?
I agree.
Yeah.
And I say that in the book. I said, presidents who enjoy first friends, I think, are the better for it, and so is our country. But it is not by any stretch a prerequisite for a successful presidency, nor is it a measure. If one has a lot of friends like George W. Bush, it doesn't mean you're going to have a successful presidency, unfortunately, in his case. And I talk about that in my preface because there was a concern expressed by somebody who interviewed Al Gore for the vice presidency. He was concerned that the then senator didn't have enough friends to be president. And ironically, the person he lost to, George Bush, as I say, did have a lot of friends, but ultimately, I think because of the Iraqi war and the recession, is regarded as having a less than totally successful presidency.
Donald Trump is not one of your profiled presidents, but we looked in our video archive and found a clip of him talking about what happens to friendships when you become president. Let's show it.
They started off by saying this will be a very short evening for Donald Trump. That was Donald Trump in those days. You know, now it's President Trump. I lost all my friends because of this position. I had friends, hey, Don, let's go to dinner. Okay, good, Richard, I'll go. Hey, Don, let's go. Okay, Larry, I'll see you later. We'll meet you at a restaurant in New York. And now they call me up. Mr. President, sir, would you like to get together sometime? I say, loosen up. Yes, call me Donald. You've known me for 30 years. Call me Donald. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate it. No, I lost all my friends because it's respect for the office. Let's face it. It's different. They used to be loose. They used to be great. You could sit back. I'm not a drinker, but you could sit back and have a drink, whatever the hell you're drinking. And now you can't do that anymore. You can't do it anymore. So I have to rely on people in Congress to be my friends.
Gary Ginsburg, Donald Trump on the loss of friendships. What he's describing there is what is commonly described for presidents as the bubble that they go into inside the White House. What are the challenges that poses for a president being in that bubble?
Well, can I go back to Trump for a second?
Sure.
I saw that clip, and it made me really want to do a chapter on Donald Trump and his first friend. And I spent a lot of time going around and around with somebody very close to him during the writing process to find that first friend, because I knew that he spent a lot of time on the phone talking to friends. There were two in particular that I was told about: Ike Perlmutter, who is the founder of Marvel, and then a guy named Phil Ruffin, who was a casino mogul. And Trump talked all the time to both men. And I asked this person, who was in a position to know, were they first friends? And he said, not really, in the sense that the conversations were the type that you would have with a really close, intimate friend. It was more about, how am I doing? And so I struggled with this person to identify that first friend. And at the end of the day, what we concluded was that Donald Trump really did not need a first friend as president. He was constitutionally not built for first friendships. He's a deeply independent man who never relied on a first friend, even in his rise to the presidency. And I think what he ultimately needed in the presidency in terms of that emotional support was the affirmation of the masses. And the way this person described it, it was really kind of his Twitter feed, to shorthand it, that gave him that emotional sustenance and that sense of confidence to bolster him throughout his term. And this person said, we would go up to Camp David, friends and family, but instead of relaxing as one would do with their friends, he sat in his cabin most of the day and would call around to supporters around the country to get that emotional support. And it was really more of this amorphous mass as opposed to any individual. In terms of I think presidents have been able throughout history to maintain close friendships despite the barriers that come from being in the Oval Office. And in modern times, as we've heard from, I think, President Obama, it was the desire to maintain that BlackBerry or that cell phone to allow that kind of constant contact. And certainly the White House, with its privacy, allows friends to come and go. And I think with President Obama, he said, I don't need any more friends than the ones I have. And he spent a lot of quality time, as he writes about in his memoir, Promised Land, about having his friends by his side throughout his presidency to give him that emotional ballast. So I don't think that being in the White House in any way secludes presidents from their ability to maintain those friendships.
Your 9 chapters are very different kinds of friendships for each of the presidents. Are there any common threads among them?
Yeah, I think the common thread is a deep and abiding friendship between the two individuals. Friendships that were mainly based on rooting for the other, mutual interests, shared interests, a friendship that transcended time and place. And what I think this differentiates the first friend from a chief of staff or anybody else who serves at the pleasure of the president is the ability to speak to the president in a way that nobody else can, and to relax the president in a way that no staffer or aide can, because they have so much history together, so many shared experiences, both good experiences and bad experiences, that allows them to kind of speak in a shorthand and to understand each other in a way that nobody who is in the employ really can I think, get to.
We have time to dig a little more deeply into a few of your chapters, and I want to start with the Bill Clinton-Vernon Jordan relationship, which the chapter title is Two Brothers of the South. Mr. Jordan died earlier this year. Let's listen to Bill Clinton eulogizing his friend.
God, we were lucky he was here. Lucky he was our friend. Lucky that in this imperfect world, somehow he found us and we found him. When they closed that coffin today, I felt like a part of my heart was going to be pulled out of my body. I felt like a man who had loved my wife and daughter with honor and helped them in a way I will never be able to describe, all the while doing everything else he was supposed to do. I just didn't want to let him go.
Gary Ginsberg, reaction?
Yeah, it was a very emotional moment for the president. I spoke to him after the funeral, and he felt that loss quite profoundly, and I think he still does 4 months later. It was an extraordinary friendship. I write, it's the longest chapter in my book, in part because I was able to speak to both the president and the friend. I was able to speak to the First Lady and her extraordinary friendship with Vernon Jordan. And what I discovered was that they were both, two brothers from the South. It defined so much of their friendship, their mutual desire to see the interests of Black Americans improved. Vernon Jordan worked, for 22 years, becoming a civil rights icon. At the same time that Bill Clinton, as governor of Arkansas, was passing a lot of progressive legislation to improve the lives of Black Arkansans. And so they were bonded by a lot of shared interests, civil rights. They loved to play sports together, golf in particular. They loved politics and the game of politics. And so much of Bill Clinton's life was enriched and empowered by Vernon Jordan. I write extensively about when Bill Clinton lost his first re-election race for Arkansas governor in 1980. He was devastated emotionally, just a shell of a man after the loss. He was the youngest ex-governor in American history. And Vernon had met him 3 years earlier. He'd met Hillary 11 years earlier and had already formed a real emotional bond with both. He flies down to Little Rock about a month and a half after the loss, and he walks into the kitchen of their new home. They've already vacated the mansion. And he speaks to Bill Clinton in a way that nobody else could. And Clinton had been calling around to all of his friends saying, what do I do now? I don't know what to do. I'm out of office. I'm too young. Do I take a job in California? Do I go become a university president? Do I go into the private sector? Vernon Jordan goes down into that kitchen and over almost 3 hours with grits breakfast says, you need to stay in the game. You're too talented to quit right now. And he got through to Bill Clinton in a way nobody else did. And Bill Clinton at the end of that breakfast said, okay, I hear you, I'm gonna stay in the game. And 2 years later, he was inaugurated as the next governor of Arkansas and stayed in the game. And 10 years later was the president of the United States. And there are so many other examples of where Vernon was next to Bill Clinton at a pivotal moment to help him either in his rise to the presidency, his choice of a vice presidency, his advice during the transition as the first Black transition chair in American presidential history, and then the role he played throughout his presidency, throughout the Lewinsky impeachment, and then in his final 20 years after his presidency, which leads to that beautiful eulogy at his funeral in March.
Talk a bit about his role as the Presidential Transition Committee chair and how important it was to guide the selections for the people who would serve in the Clinton administration.
So it really begins with the vice presidential selection. I was one of the kind of junior lawyers that were assigned to vetting different candidates. He was the vice chair, and he was the person that Clinton kind of entrusted with making the first 3 calls to the 3 candidates that he really wanted that were on his true shortlist. And I don't think it's ever been disclosed before in a book, but his first choice was not Al Gore. His first choice was, depending on who you talk to, either Bill Bradley or Jay Rockefeller. Vernon told me it was Jay Rockefeller. Clinton says no, it was Bill Bradley. But Vernon made the calls. Both Senator Bradley and Senator Jay Rockefeller both declined to run. Jay Rockefeller, interestingly, said, I think you're going to lose, and I'm going to run for president in '96. Not the greatest choice. Bill Bradley just didn't want to be vice president and turned it down in a meeting with Warren Christopher early in the process. And then Vernon called his very good friend Colin Powell and said, Governor Clinton wants to run with you. Are you interested? And Colin Powell didn't want to run. So then it went to the longer list, and Vernon was obviously a very key voice around the governor, ultimately picking Al Gore, who ended up being a great vice president. In the transition, what was interesting is that Bill Clinton wanted Vernon Jordan to be his attorney general. And he has him come down in late November of '92, and they sit in the back porch of the mansion. And he says, Vernon, I need you to be my attorney general. You will be the best attorney general I can have. There had been 77 white attorneys general until then. He wanted to break that. He wanted somebody of color or a woman. He really wanted Vernon. And Vernon said to him, no, I can be more valuable to you as your first friend. And he was throughout the presidency. Whenever Clinton had a really thorny problem, he would say, call Vernon, and Vernon would come, and Vernon would give great advice. On the transition itself, to your question, I'm sorry it takes so long getting to it, but he said to Vernon, I want the most diverse administration in history. And Vernon made sure that, in fact, in terms of the number of people of color, Latinos, women, it was the most diverse up till that time. They have become even more diverse since the Clinton presidency, but at that point, he was able to achieve his campaign promise of having the most diverse administration.
You referenced Whitewater and the Ken Starr investigation, and we have a clip because it is not the only chapter in which a first friend faces some legal or certainly public relations challenges from their associations with presidents, and Vernon Jordan was one of those. Here he is in January of 1998 on the Clinton-Monica Lewinsky affair.
I want to say to you absolutely and unequivocally that Ms. Lewinsky told me in no uncertain terms that she did not have a sexual relationship with the president. At no time did I ever say, suggest, or intimate to her that she should lie.
Gary Ginsberg, you write that there are some permanently unresolved questions about Vernon Jordan's role. What is known?
Well, what is known is what was in the Starr report. The Starr report found no evidence that he had obstructed justice by offering her a job. I think the record does show that he was careful enough and smart enough to never directly want to know whether the president had a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And the good thing for Vernon is that Vernon made it a practice of helping people, younger people in particular, find jobs. He loved the role of being, kind of the mentor. And he mentored and found jobs for literally hundreds, if not thousands of people throughout his career. It was part of his charm and part of why he was so beloved. And I asked Clinton later, did you ever speak to Vernon about this relationship? And he said no. And I was smart enough to know that I didn't want to implicate my friends, and he was, I think, frankly, he was uncomfortable talking about any affairs with women other than his wife. And I think Vernon was smart enough to know what to know, and was able to then to get through 20 hours of grand jury testimony without perjuring himself and without implicating the president, so that the president ultimately was impeached on counts that were unrelated to Vernon, and Vernon obviously was never charged and was never formally in any way implicated in it, other than as a witness.
You write about the personal role that he took with the First Lady and Chelsea Clinton, and it seemed that the president himself was referring to that in his eulogy, the special role he played with his spouse and daughter. What, in fact, did Vernon Jordan do as that family faced that personal crisis as well as a political one?
This has never been reported before, to my knowledge. After the president confessed to Hillary that it was, in fact, a sexual relationship, and then confessed to the nation, they take that trip to Martha's Vineyard. They spend time with Vernon. I believe it was after they got back to the White House when Bill Clinton, so it's sometime in September of '98, Bill Clinton asks Vernon Jordan to go speak to Hillary, to tell her, to convince her, persuade her not to leave the president. I think things had gotten so bad between the two of them that she was seriously contemplating it. And as Bill Clinton told me later, he was the only person that he could trust to have such a conversation. And to Hillary, he was the only person that had her respect, such that whatever he said would resonate and be meaningful. So he, in that moment, really did play the ultimate first friend role. That's the only time in my book where a first friend played such a crucial role in maintaining the marriage between a president and the First Lady.
Did Whitewater investigation test their friendship? Did it ever get breached?
I think it did test the friendship, and then I think President Clinton felt guilty about putting Vernon inadvertently, according to the president, and I believe him, into that uncomfortable national spotlight as a witness and as a potential obstructor of justice. I don't think when Betty Currie called Vernon and asked Vernon to meet with Monica Lewinsky to help her with a job, did the president ever think that it would end up resulting in 20 hours of grand jury testimony and so much spotlight on a man who was used to playing a more behind the scenes role, as he did when he left the Urban League and went into private practice. And I think that it was unresolved actually for a couple of years. And I write at the end of the book about a late night, bull session between the two of them. It's sometime in either late December or early January of 2001, when Vernon gets a call from the president on a Saturday late afternoon. He says, "Can you come and have dinner with me?" And Vernon, being as independent as ever, says, "I already have a dinner, but I can come and see you around 9 o'clock. And so at 9 o'clock, he drives up to the South Portico and he goes upstairs into the White House kitchen on the second floor. And they spend 6 hours talking. And I think, and I've confirmed this with President Clinton, that they had never really talked about what it meant to have both gone through that process and whether there was any lingering anger on the part of Vernon that he was thrust into that role. And I think it was really important for President Clinton to have that 6 hours over a $10,000 bottle of wine, which I think Vernon did most of the drinking because the president doesn't drink, or they may have just wasted a $10,000 bottle. But it was really important to President Clinton that he air it out and that he, I think, was reassured at the end of that 6 hours that Vernon did not hold it against him, that Vernon did not think that Bill Clinton had intentionally put him in harm's way by helping find Monica Lewinsky a job in New York. And as I write at the end of my book, Vernon gets back in his red Cadillac convertible and he starts driving down the south driveway. And he's overcome with emotion realizing that he has just left the White House, probably for the last time, with his closest friend in the world, the most powerful man on the planet, having this no-holds-barred conversation for 6 hours. And he's halfway down the driveway when his eyes start to well up with tears. And he realizes, here I am, the son of a postman, grew up in the first public housing project in the United States, and I just had this conversation. He stops his car, he tears up, he puts his head on the steering wheel, he waits some period of time, and then he turns the car back on and drives out the driveway. And it was really, for me, a particularly emotional moment to hear that story told by Vernon, and then to talk to the president about what it meant to him.
Richard Nixon and Bibi Rebozo. If Bill Clinton had 1,000 friends, how would you describe Richard Nixon's attitude about friendship?
It's a great question. He was not a man who had a lot of friends, Richard Nixon. Dwight Eisenhower, I found this great anecdote. He goes to visit his vice president in the 50s. He's in the hospital for a couple of days. And he comes back from the hospital and he says to his assistant, it's the damnedest thing. He has nobody around him. How can a man who's in such a position of authority have no friends? And, you know, if you look at Richard Nixon's life, he had Bibi as his first friend. He had one or two other friends that, you know, would qualify in a conventional sense of friendship. But as somebody said, his first friend was really his yellow legal pad. That was the person he felt, or the object that he felt most comfortable with. But with Bibi Rebozo, it was really a study of contrasts. Nixon was this intellectual. He was dark and brooding. Rebozo was a high school graduate whose first job was as an airline steward. But somehow it worked. And I think it worked because Nixon had enough common sense to know that he needed a friend to break him from his moodiness. Nixon could sit in silence for hours with Bibi, and they often did sit in silence. But Bibi knew just the right moment to interject with a quip, with an anecdote, to break that kind of moodiness and lift Nixon back into the world. And that was the role he played. He was his raconteur, he was his entertainer, he was his chef. They would mix martinis together, they would grill steaks together, they would take boat rides together. They would sit at Camp David weekend after weekend and watch movies and get drunk. Frankly, there's a great anecdote in my book about how they just tied one on one night while Henry Kissinger is back at the White House trying to figure out how to bomb Cambodia. And finally, he just puts Bibi on the phone, and they're both pretty sloshed. And Bibi says, hey, Henry, it's your ass if this doesn't work out well. And this is to the future Secretary of State. You know, it was a pretty astonishing moment for Kissinger, who retold the story for years and years afterward. And then ultimately, it's a story of loyalty that doesn't have any boundaries. When Nixon asks Rebozo to help aid and abet his most nefarious schemes to secure his power and hurt and punish his enemies, and he takes a $100,000 bribe from Howard Hughes in 1970. And as I write in my chapter, I think that is the impetus for the later bugging of the DNC headquarters at Watergate and then Nixon's impeachment and resignation.
We have people listening to this will know that Richard Nixon taped his Oval Office calls, and we have one from 1972 where the two men are talking, and it's really just a way to listen to the rapport between the two of them. Let's play it.
I tell you, they just didn't dream that you would do this in election year.
Yeah. Well, it'll of course probably, as they've already said, most people think it'll sink the Russian summit, but I don't
think so.
But if it does, what the hell?
I don't think it will. I think they're going to want it all the more.
Well, I don't know.
You didn't say a thing about China. I tell you, it was just a magnificent thing. I've never had such a reaction on anything. Never. My phone was ringing off the hook from people who don't normally call. They might express themselves later. But it was just a phenomenal thing, and the reaction is just...
The call's all male.
I told Bob...
Apollon?
I told Bob Haldeman last night, one woman called, and I didn't know whether she was drunk or just emotional, crying. And I don't know who she was. I didn't want to ask her. And how she got my home number, I don't know.
Probably got it off of the wall of some toilet.
really easy conversation between the two of them. So
Yes.
what do you make of that level of conversation?
Yeah, I think that was very typical of their relationship. You hear the cheerleading, right? I haven't gotten so many calls. Everybody loved it. That was his role. He was there to provide uplift. As I say, to be a cheerleader. Pat Nixon was quite disparaging of it. She described Bibi as, quote, a sponge, that he never gave Nixon a hard time. He never fought back. Interestingly, though, I found one example where he did, and I give him more credit than he probably has received for his first friendship. In 1967, Nixon's struggling with whether to run for the presidency in 1968. And Bibi Rebozo is so ingrained as first friend. He's exceedingly close, not only to Nixon, but to Pat and the two daughters. He's basically, he's the godfather to Trisha's son. He's very close to Trisha. And what I read in my book is that he says to Nixon, don't run. And the reason why he does is that he saw better than anybody the emotional toll that losing in 1960 and then 1962, when he loses the California governorship, he saw the toll that it exacted on Pat most particularly, as well as the daughters. And I suggest, and there's evidence to support it, that Nixon may have beat Pat Nixon. Julie Nixon denies it, but others like Cy Hirsch believe that it was so. But there was clearly a lot of pain that went through the family as a result of those losses. And Rebozo selflessly says to Nixon, don't run. It will exact the same toll again if you lose. Nixon obviously goes on to win, and Rebozo, right, becomes the first friend. He's the most celebrated first friend, I think, in history because of modern media. I grew up I was a 12-year-old, and I watched Bibi Rebozo and was transfixed by this dapper man who was always by Nixon's side. But I think he did provide Nixon with a respite and an emotional companionship that he certainly never had with Pat and didn't have with any other figure in his life.
How should we process this one factoid that you report in the book? From Nixon's second inaugural to his resignation, in the space of 20 months, Richard Nixon took 60 separate trips to Camp David, Key Biscayne, or San Clemente, with Bibi Rebozo as his sole companion.
Yes, I mean, that goes to the point. I don't think he had any kind of relationship with his wife. Bibi was the perfect companion. He spoke when Nixon wanted to converse. He stayed silent when Nixon didn't. I talked to somebody very close to Richard Nixon who witnessed this relationship throughout. And he said that the reason why Nixon liked him is even though Nixon was the intellectual and Bibi was the anti-intellectual, when he was down, he didn't want to engage intellectually. He didn't want to engage socially. He just needed to be on his own. And essentially by being with Rebozo, he was on his own because Rebozo could just sit there with him. There's a great anecdote that John Dean tells me where the Secret Service was upset because Rebozo insisted on driving cars when Nixon was president and driving the boat. And the Secret Service goes to John Dean, the White House counsel, and says, that's against protocol. We got to drive the boat. We got to drive the car. Dean works out a compromise where Rebozo will drive the boat, but the Secret Service agent will sit up above the boat. So they go off on a boat trip, and it's an hour into the boat trip, and the Secret Service agent doesn't hear a word from below. It's like, this is so odd. These two guys are going out for a boat ride, and not a word's been exchanged. So he climbs down, he peers into the stateroom, and there's two men literally just sitting there, just staring out at the sea and not saying a word. He watches for another hour. Nothing is exchanged. So the Secret Service agent goes back and he tells Dean this, and Dean's fascinated. It's like, how does that work? So he calls up the agents who do the walks in San Clemente. He says, what do you witness when the two take these long walks on the beach? And the same thing is told to John Dean. They walk in silence. But Nixon, as I said, had enough sense to know that left entirely alone, he would get too dark and he would play to his worst angels or his worst fears and his worst instincts. So he at least wanted companionship around, and the companionship knew when to interject to make sure he didn't descend to too great a depth.
What happened to Mr. Rebozo over the legal issues you referenced?
He ultimately only paid an IRS fine for unreported income from this $100,000 bribe that he took from Howard Hughes. Some of that money went to Nixon for a putting green and other home amenities. Some went to Rosemary Woods. Some went to Nixon's valet. And as I said in my book, I really think that Nixon was so paranoid about this loan and what Larry O'Brien knew, because Larry O'Brien had been a PR consultant to Howard Hughes when that loan was made or that bribe was made. And Nixon was afraid that he had the goods and was going to use it. And I think that was part of why he wanted his office bugged. There's been no definitive evidence to show that, but there's enough in the Senate report that was eventually, it came to light in 2005 that Terry Lenzner also writes about in a book, to suggest that Nixon was so afraid of that coming to light that he bugged the headquarters.
Did the friendship survive Watergate?
It did. It did. And I end the chapter with an anecdote where Nixon goes to a charity event that Rebozo is holding to speak for him, and they were best friends right until the end. And in fact, I was going to end it with a different conclusion where Rebozo was basically making sure that Pat Nixon could be buried at the library. There was a California law that prohibited that because Nixon really wanted Pat buried there, and then he ultimately wanted himself to be buried there. And Rebozo played the same role in Nixon's post-presidency that he played during his presidency. He was the best friend right till the end.
We have 20 minutes left in our conversation, and I want to spend 10 minutes on two presidents whose first friends had significant foreign policy implications. The first is Harry Truman and Eddie Jacobson. We're going to listen to Harry Truman talking about Harry Jacobson and prejudice against Jewish people in this clip from the early 1960s.
I found in the United States a lot of bigotry and opposition to Jews as such, which I could never understand for the simple reason that the Jewish people gave us our moral code entirely. And I had a partner when I first got out of the White House and moved back to Kansas City, a fellow by the name of Eddie Jacobson. And he and I started a haberdashery store, and we went broke and lost a lot of money. I furnished the money, and Eddie furnished the know-how. But when we went broke, why, they forced Eddie into bankruptcy. They couldn't put me into bankruptcy because I was on the county court. That was long before I was president of the United States. I said it was afterwards, but it was before. And of course, when the thing was all over and Eddie became prosperous after that, he met his share of those losses. And that's my idea of a good Jew.
Gary Ginsberg, what was the nature of their relationship?
So they met in 1903 when Truman was a bank teller and Eddie was a 16-year-old running down to the bank to deposit on behalf of a company that he was working for. They didn't really stay in touch for the next 14 years. They then meet in the Army. They're both training to go over to Europe. They're in the same infantry, same unit. And Eddie had a real way with making money. And he figures out how to professionalize the canteen that Truman, as kind of the leader of the group, was in charge of. And they have two successful businesses that I write about in the chapter. So when they come back from the war, they're friends, they're business associates, and they decide, let's start this haberdashery, as Truman just says in that clip. And it's a failure, not because they didn't know what they were doing, it's because commodity prices dropped in the early 1920s and people lost their ability to buy nice shirts and ties. So Eddie stays in the haberdashery business for the rest of his life. Truman goes on to become, obviously, president. Where the relationship becomes so consequential is in 1948. Truman has a very difficult decision to make. What do you do with the land of Palestine? Now, Truman was never known as a great friend of the Jews, even to Eddie. Eddie was never allowed into Truman's home. Truman lived in his wife's family's home, the Wallace home. Truman's mother-in-law did not like Jews and never let Jews inside their home, nor did Truman's wife. But Eddie was fine with that. Eddie loved Harry Truman, and Harry Truman loved Eddie. And so in 48, he's got to decide what to do. And he's really frustrated because he's being lobbied very hard by Jewish leaders in the United States who are pushing Truman to support the partition plan that the UN had put forth that would create two states, a state for the Palestinians and a state for the Jews. And the partition plan passes, the United States supports it, but now it's becoming crunch time. It's between November of 47 and the end of the British mandate, which expires in May of 48. And now we're in March of 1948. It's 2 months before the mandate ends. And he's sick of the issue because, as he says, Jesus Christ couldn't please the Jews when he was alive. How am I supposed to please them? And whatever he says or he does, he doesn't think it's enough for those that he has been meeting with. And he just decides, I'm done with the issue. George Marshall, his Secretary of State, is vehemently opposed to creating an independent Jewish state. He thinks that the Soviets will move right in. It will lead to war. It will lead to the annihilation of the Jews. And it won't serve American interests because the Soviets will be in the sphere and because oil may be cut off from American consumers. So Marshall's against it, as is the State Department. Truman has been supporting the resettlement of Jewish refugees into Israel. And as you heard in that clip, he has a real affinity for the Jewish people as a man of the Bible. So he's frustrated. He's not going to deal with it. Eddie Jacobson gets a phone call saying, fly halfway across the country. You got to lobby Harry Truman to see Chaim Weizmann, who's the most important person advocating for a Jewish state. He's sitting in New York. He's waiting to make his pitch. Everybody in the Zionist cause knows that unless he sees Chaim Weizmann, he's never going to get to a decision to support a state. He flies to Washington. He walks up the north driveway. He walks into the Oval Office. He says, I want to see Harry, my friend. He's not invited. He has no appointment. The appointment secretary says, you can go in and see Harry. Do not bring up the Palestine issue. He doesn't want to talk about it. So Eddie walks in. They make small talk. Harry says to him, well, what are you here for? Why'd you fly across the country for this? He says, you got to meet Chaim Weizmann. Truman says, I am not going to deal with this issue. I'm sick of it. I've been hectored and badgered by all these Jewish leaders. I'm tired of this issue. Go away. Eddie says, Harry, you and I have been friends for 40 years. I know you. I know who your hero is. He points to a statue of Andrew Jackson. And he says, what would Andrew Jackson do? What were the values that Andrew Jackson held? You have a hero in Andrew Jackson. I have a hero in Chaim Weizmann. You owe it to yourself, and you owe it to me, and you owe it to the Jewish people to see Chaim Weizmann. You have to do it. So now Truman turns his back to Eddie. He strums his fingers against the desk, turns back around, and he says, all right, you win, you goddamn son of a bee. I'll see him. He sees Chaim Weizmann 9 days later, and then 2 months later, he is the first foreign leader to recognize an independent state of Israel 11 minutes after it's declared in Tel Aviv. It's I think the most dramatic moment of a friend being able to speak to a leader to affect world history.
Well, in close running, I'd say, is the story you referenced earlier of Jack Kennedy and David Ormsby Gore and the Cuban Missile Crisis. How did a man who was the British ambassador to the United States play such a consequential role in that pivotal moment in that presidency?
The reason it was born of a 25-year friendship, a friendship of mutual interests. They met as early 20-something men in pre-war London. They loved to talk fast. They loved to play fast. They loved to carouse. They loved to play golf. And they loved to argue. They loved to argue about what is the role of a leader in a democracy. Is it to lead and not worry about where the electorate's sentiments are? Like a Churchill who said, we have to rearm, and I don't care if the British voters are tired of war. The Germans are rearming, and we have to rearm now. Or is it like a Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain, which is to accede to the wishes of the electorate and then hope that they will come around to the right view? So they debate this issue for literally 25 years. And Ormsby Gore is of the Churchill mindset, that a leader is brought on this earth to lead and to do the right thing. And so by the time that Kennedy has to confront the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's been the beneficiary of Ormsby Gore's really shrewd advice as somebody in the British Foreign Ministry who had risen up negotiating with the Soviets over nuclear disarmament. So he had a really great window into the mindset of the Soviet Union. And Kennedy had relied on him in 1958 when he's running for re-election against Cabot Lodge, and then in 1960 when he's running for president. He becomes his most important foreign policy advisor on the campaign as a British citizen, as you say. So now it's 1962, and it's day 5 of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I begin my chapter with Kennedy getting this phone call from his brother saying, we got to decide whether to blockade or bomb. We got to decide what to do. So Kennedy goes back to the White House and he issues 4 orders of what he's going to do over the next 24 hours. And the 4th order is, I want to see David Ormsby Gore in the White House on Sunday morning. That's day 6. So Gore comes to the White House that Sunday morning, and he's ushered into the residence and he sees Kennedy, and Kennedy says, I need your advice now more than ever. We've been debating these issues in hypotheticals and abstracts for 25 years. Now it's the future of mankind at stake. And they have a no-holds-barred conversation. Should I bomb or blockade? And Ormsby Gore is of the firm mind that you got to blockade. And then over dinner that night, they discuss, how am I going to discuss this with the American people in my national address the next day? And Ormsby Gore gives him language to use. 2 days later, he's back in the White House. They have a long scheduled dinner. At the end of that dinner, he goes to the Long Gallery and they spend hours. And I write at length about this. Here's the British ambassador. He says to the president, he's the ambassador, I'm sorry, he's the ambassador, and he says to the president, look, your speech last night did not play in Europe. No one believes you. They don't believe the CIA. You have to put out evidentiary proof that these missiles really do exist. So Kennedy calls down, he says, I want all the pictures of the missile sites. And the 2 of them are crouched on the floor in the Long Gallery, actually looking at which pictures to release to the public the next day. And then Ormsby Gore starts talking about the blockade. He wants to know the specifics. Is it how many miles offshore of Cuba is it? He's told it's 800 miles. And Ormsby Gore says, I think that doesn't give the British the Soviet ships enough time to really think about the consequences of breaking the blockade. Let's move in the perimeter to 500 miles, give them more time. Kennedy's really intrigued by that. So Kennedy calls McNamara, they debate it. The question is, can Cuban planes reach at 500 miles when they can't reach at 800 miles? Kennedy doesn't care. He says, let's move the perimeter in. It's moved into 500 miles. Throughout that week, Ormsby Gore plays this very central role in advising the president. And there's one moment when Lyndon Johnson is sitting in an ExCom meeting. He's at the end of the cabinet table, and the door is banging against his chair. And he goes, I'm the vice president of the United States. And there's this British guy sitting right next to the president. I don't get it. What's going on? But most people around the president recognized that they were so in a mind meld about how to confront foreign policy issues. And it plays out most dramatically the following year when Ormsby Gore is really the intellectual catalyst for the limited nuclear test ban treaty that Kennedy signs late in his life at the end of, middle of 1963, end of his life, which I think ushers in the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And it's really a remarkable testament to their friendship and to the leadership of Ormsby Gore on getting Kennedy to take disarmament as a big issue for him at the waning days of his presidency.
Do you think there's a full book there? You said earlier that this story, but for Caroline, would have been somewhat lost to history. Why don't we know more about someone who had such a consequential no? And how did you find out as much as you did?
Well, it's not that it hasn't been reported. Barbara Leeming, in The Education of a Statesman, writes about it, and so I give her enormous credit for kind of being the first historian to dig it out. I think one of the problems is that Ormsby Gore gave only 77 pages of oral testimony at the Kennedy Library. I think it's essentially one volume. If you're going to look for a first friend, Lem Billings just screams because he gave 14 hours of oral history of their enormously rich friendship that starts at Choate and extends right on through to the end. Lem Billings had his own his own basic bedroom on the 3rd floor of the White House. And when you ask most people who was his first friend, if you exclude family, because Bobby was obviously so close to him, people say Len Billings. But I think Ormsby Gore, in reality, was his first friend, as Caroline told me. I think he and his wife, Sissy, spent more time with the president and First Lady than any other couple. Sissy Gore was told the morning after Kennedy is shot and killed, at this memorial service in the East Room of the White House, Jackie Kennedy walks around to all the closest friends and family who are gathered for the kind of the first service in memory of the fallen president. And in a whisper, she says to Sissy Gore, "You would have been the godmother to our son Patrick had he lived." They didn't know that because Patrick died a couple of days after being born. They were that close. And Caroline had known that and had told me that when she was telling me that Ormsby Gore was so close to her father and mother. And I think what gives it such an added dimension is they weren't just great pals, but that this friendship had such an impact on history, both in his intellectual kind of development as a statesman, John Kennedy, and then in his performance as president, as we saw both in the Cuban Missile Crisis and then in the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty.
Here was a surprise line. Later on, Ormsby Gore proposed to Jacqueline Kennedy.
He did, and I was not aware of that. He did. We only know about that because letters that were exchanged between the First Lady, the former First Lady, and Ormsby Gore were discovered in a trunk in 2017 at the Gore estate, the Harlech estate, and the family chose to put them up for auction, and they were auctioned off at pretty princely sums. And in that correspondence was a letter from Ormsby Gore to Jackie saying, "I want to marry you," and a letter back from Jackie, which I quote in the chapter, where she says, "There's just too much shared pain between us to ever find joy. And if we're going to find that joy, we have to do it apart from each other," which is a remarkable testament to, I think, the real respect and love that they shared between the two, but the emotional maturity of Jackie to realize that they were so consumed by their shared grief over the loss of the president to ever really truly revel in each other's presence without that looming over them.
What had happened to his wife?
His wife died in a car accident. I mean, Ormsby Gore, for such a brilliant, talented man, lived such a life of tragedy. His older brother dies in a car accident. Ormsby Gore himself loved to drive cars very fast. His wife dies in a car accident. He himself dies in a car accident at the age of 65 in the mid-80s. He loses multiple children to suicides or overdoses. I talked to his daughter Jane, who's a delightful woman. She's in her 70s. She was the inspiration for Lady Jane from the Rolling Stones. She had a sister who was engaged to Eric Clapton. It was a fascinating family. I'd love to go over there and actually meet them. It's a lordship. It's the Harlech family. He was a lord in waiting, David Ormsby Gore. He didn't want to be a lord. His older brother, as I say, died, and so he actually fell to him as the second son. And he ultimately does serve in the House of Lords and is a lord. But, I think his defining moment was really being this first friend of John Kennedy and helping shape the relationship so profoundly between Great Britain and the United States during the early 60s. It was a really special time for a special relationship.
Gary Ginsberg, we have about 3-4 minutes left, and kind of put some closing thoughts on this. You've been interested in the presidency, you write, since elementary school. You've worked around presidents and presidential candidates. Did working on this project change your view of the office in any way?
Yes. Just of how lonely it is. And I think I was struck by that with FDR, whom we don't speak about. But here he is. The last thing you would think about FDR is a lonely man. His son obviously recognized it because he subtitles his memoir of his father, A Lonely Man. But I was really struck at that one friendship, because FDR, despite fighting a world war and despite fighting a global, a depression, is intensely lonely. And he says to to Daisy Suckley, who is my first friend in the book. He says, I'm either Exhibit A or left entirely alone. And I think all presidents, to some extent, feel that. Now, I think it was particularly difficult for Roosevelt because he had absolutely no home life. You know, Eleanor was a great crusader for the causes she cared about, and she was often away from the White House. And his kids were either at war or not, frankly, interested in providing their father with an emotional presence. And I think you saw that certainly with Nixon. And I think you see it to some extent with all presidents, that it is a really lonely job. And that's why a first friendship is so important, because we experience it in our own lives, both, you know, in moments of loneliness, wanting to have a friend, and in moments of great joy, wanting to have a friend to share with. Now imagine applying it to the most powerful person on the planet, and how much more important it can be, both for good or for ill, you know, when it goes awry, as it did, I think, with Bibi Rebozo. And that's why I thought it was kind of a rich topic for a book. And hopefully I tell 9 good stories that kind of reflect all of that.
The book, as we've been talking about, is called First Friends. It's Gary Ginsberg's first book. I want to thank you for spending an hour with C-SPAN and sharing some of the stories that readers will find inside. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
All Q&A programs are available on our website or as a podcast at cspan.org.